Jim Bickerton, welcome back to SABC News. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too, Sherwin. Thanks for having me on.
As we mark the one-year anniversary of the killing of South African Lindani Myeni in April last year, what are some of your thoughts and reflections, particularly for South Africans who were really struck, Jim, by how one of their own could die at the hands of the police in the United States?
Well, I think one of the hardest things to accept is how slowly justice is delivered. We've seen in other parts of the U.S. it moves a lot quicker. What's happening with us is that we don't have a trial date until September of 2023. So we're still a year and a half away from a trial. And that's very frustrating for us and for the family, more importantly than for us. It's just really unacceptable. Now, in defense of our system, it is because of the COVID pandemic that these court delays resulted. We weren't trying any cases at all for about 2 years, and we've just now started trying them again. I just did the first jury trial in Hawaii in about 2.5 years. There may have been one other. And we all had to stand 6 feet apart and wear masks throughout. The witnesses testified through clear masks. So the courts are making an effort to whittle down the backlog, but it's very frustrating. On a personal level, or from Lindsay's point of view, she's living in South Africa. She's working there, raising her children there, and that is home for her. But I don't think the loss has diminished with the passage of a year.
Jim, I want to talk about that wrongful death lawsuit that you filed on behalf of Lindsay Myeni. But before we get there, we of course know that the decision by the Honolulu prosecuting attorney Steve Elm announcing in June last year that the use of deadly force by the police was justified and that they did not file charges against the police officers involved. Why do you disagree with that decision?
Oh, we disagree very much with that because there were two fundamental things that really went wrong in that investigation. The first one is he just asserted with no evidence that Lindani could see the officers. We have actual body cam video now of the officers talking after the event. And one of the shooters is saying, I couldn't see a thing. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't see, over and over again. The police officer who's holding a flashlight says he can't see. So the chances that Lindani could see anything with those flashlights in his eyes is non-existent. The second thing that was, I think, a failure by the prosecutors, he looked only at the final shooter. So if you'll remember the sequence of events, Lindani goes towards the police officer who's ordering him on the ground. And I would remind your viewers that he was ordering someone on the ground during the very week that the George Floyd the murder of George Floyd trial was going on. And tensions were very high and people were very wary of police encounters. And here he is ordering someone on the ground at night with a flashlight in Lindani's face and not saying who he was, and coming from the house.
Jim, part of the wrongful death lawsuit filed, in that lawsuit you say that the responding officers were motivated by racial discrimination. Is that something you stand by?
I still believe that, and I haven't seen any reason not to. I believe that it's a subtle form of racial discrimination. I don't feel it's like, oh, here's a black man, let's shoot him. It's much more like, here's a black man, we don't need to give him the dignity of announcing ourselves. In other words, we can treat him in a lesser way than we might treat someone else. If it was someone else, they might have said, sir, freeze, we're police.
Yeah.
But because they see a black man, they say, get on the ground without further ado.
We saw a report a week ago that the Honolulu Police Commission has approved taxpayer funds to cover the legal bills of at least 2 HPD officers who killed Lindani, officers Garrick Orozco and Brent Sylvester. Explain what the goal of the civil lawsuit is and what success looks like from yours and the family's perspective.
Well, a civil lawsuit can't result in anyone going to prison. but it can do two things. The first thing, and I think probably the most important from the family's perspective, is to shine the light of truth on the situation and bring forward all the evidence and show who's being truthful and candid and honest about things and who's not. And in that process, have some accountability. The second thing it does, and it's really very important, although it's a little more mundane, is that it is designed to seek compensation. And you know, the way that we look at it is Lindsay and her family and Lindani, they've already paid. So compensation is to try to put them back a little bit of what was taken. And it is really important, I think, in a case where there are small children and a widow, when you had a two-income family and two parents to raise these two young children, to suddenly put it all on the shoulders of a woman by herself leaves a big gap in the lives of the family and particularly of the children in terms of the support, financial and emotional support that they would have received. And the aim of the suit, I think, is to get some fair compensation that will try to fill that gap. It can't obviously fill the real gap, the hole in their hearts, but it can make up for the financial contribution and some of the other contributions that Lindani would have made to the family had he lived.
Let me ask you this. Have you, Jim, been able to depose the couple at the house, right? That the woman that made the call to the police. I mean, we've seen the doorbell video, this very irate state pointing at Lindani, really escalating a situation that perhaps didn't warrant it. Have you been able to speak to those two, and what have you gleaned from those conversations?
We did. Well, they weren't really conversations. They were formal interrogations that we did of them, and we were able to question them. And it was apparent that they could not identify any physical aggression or threat by Lindani. It was also apparent that there was a strong communication problem in the sense that their English isn't very good to begin with, and his English is excellent, but it's perhaps accented with a South African accent that they might not have been familiar with. The couple of years they've spent in the U.S. were spent in New Jersey, which has a different way of speaking. So it's clear that they weren't really understanding each other. It was very clear from the video, which we did not have at the time that we questioned them. We had not yet gotten the doorbell video. We got it right after we questioned them. We know that Lindani was very peaceful. The husband was untruthful in his deposition because I asked him, I said, did Lindani apologize in any way for the intrusion? And he said, no. But we have him on the doorbell video actually telling his landlord as Lindani's leaving, saying, it's okay, he apologized. So the husband completely understood what was going on. And the wife, I don't really understand what drove her. It makes very little sense why she would get so worked up when her husband clearly wasn't. But she did.
And after Lindani had left, he had walked to his car.
After he had left.
Continued to escalate the situation.
She escalated it. Her comments probably drove the officers. It's hard to say that that's, something that, I think the law does permit her to be held accountable for that. We have not added them to this case, but the case isn't over yet. We have 2 years to add all the people who might be added to this case. And so I wouldn't say that we've ruled out adding them, but it is obviously harder to make the case for that a civilian gets overly excited and upset versus a police officer. A police officer they come to scenes all the time where people are distraught for no good reason. And they're expected to be able to sort that out. And that's what I think is part of the problem here, is that he accepted the hysterical wailing of this renter who was staying just for a few days, really, at this house, and didn't give any kind of equal respect to the person who was standing peacefully out on the lawn. The other police officer who approached Lindani, we now know from the body cam video because he recites to other officers what was happening. And he did speak to Lindani. And Lindani spoke to him, according to this officer. And it's what we call an excited utterance. He was reporting this moments after it happened. And he said that his words were, "What's going on?"
Yeah.
And Lindani said, "You tell me." Now, it doesn't show that Lindani was aware that this guy was a police officer either. Remember, they're all holding flashlights on a night with no moon. There's a street light in the distance, but these are very bright flashlights. So Lindani, we have no evidence that he knew the first person was an officer, and no reason to think that the man who was shouting at him to get on the ground was a police officer, because he didn't say he was a police officer. You can assume the opposite. So go ahead.
I'll ask you just a couple more, Jim. Give us a timeline. You mentioned September 2023 when the civil lawsuit will go to trial. Is this a jury trial? Just explain how this works to South Africans.
Yes, it would be a jury trial. 12 members of the community would decide whether or not the police officers acted unreasonably. That's the test. It's like a negligence test, failure to exercise reasonable care. And it's typically measured by the standards of their profession. Obviously, everyone has different standards in different professions. So the jury would be asked to look at what the police officers did and say, did they act as a reasonable police officer would in the situation? And was that failure to act, if they find there was a failure to act reasonably, was that a part of the cause of Lindani's death? And those two questions would be put to a jury. And if they answered yes on those, then the jury would answer a third question, which is how much compensation should the family receive?
Final question for you. You mentioned that Lindsay and the kids have moved to South Africa soon after that killing in Hawaii for the funeral and then stayed on. How are they doing, Jim?
Well, I think they're doing okay. I don't want to say great, because I don't think that it can be great after something like this.
No.
But I think that they are making a good life for themselves. They're finding happiness in South Africa. And Lindsay likes that she is in Lindani's home and that his children are in their home.
Jim Bickerton, as always, thanks for making time to speak with us here on SABC News. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Sherwin.
Jim Bickerton, founding partner of the Bickerton Law Group and the attorney representing the family of the late Lindani Myeni in their civil lawsuit against the city and county of Honolulu.